There's just so much inconsistencies in the timelines that the officers reported that don't necessarily make sense to me, and I could be overthinking this, so I apologize in advance. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but let's just get into it.
I like killing. It's so much fun.
On July of 1969, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner newspaper containing those chilling words in a coded message. The Zodiac is what he called himself, the sender of bizarre letters with threats and odd demands. The Zodiac terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It's crazy to think that it's been over 5 decades and the Zodiac's identity is still unknown. The killer just vanished in the 1970s, but his legacy continues, having inspired many movies, TV shows, and even real copycat serial killers. Let's start with our first victim of the Zodiac, or a possible victim, I should say. High school sweethearts and engaged couple Robert Dominguez, 18, and Linda Edwards, 17, decided to participate in the senior ditch day by going sunbathing. The year was June 4th, 1963. The couple went to a remote beach near Gaviota State Park. Strangely, the couple didn't return home that Tuesday. Robert's father went to the beach the following day and was horrified to discover their bodies lying together inside the remains of a crumbling shack. The sequence of events that unfolded aren't exactly known, but investigators believe the assailant ordered Linda to tie Robert's hands, but Robert was able to free himself and fight back enough for them to run away. Unfortunately, the victims were shot in the back. They fell to the ground and then killed with a .22 caliber weapon. Robert was shot 11 times and Linda had been shot 9 times. The killer then dragged the bodies to the shack. He tried to burn down the shack to rid of the evidence but failed to start a fire. It was believed this was the Zodiac Killer, as Winchester Western Watch Super X ammunition was used, the same ammunition used by the Zodiac during the 1968 murders on Lake Herman Road. The Dominguez-Edwards case also has similarities to the Zodiac's attack of another young couple at Lake Berryessa in 1969. The Zodiac's next possible victim was an 18-year-old Sherry Josephine Bates, who lived with her father Joseph and was a student at Riverside City College in Riverside, California. On October 30th, Hallows Eve, 1966, she left a note that read, "Dad went to the RCC library." Halloween morning, her Volkswagen Beetle was found abandoned in the library parking lot, and her body was lying nearby between 2 houses. Sherry was beaten and stabbed multiple times. She was stabbed with a short-bladed knife. Her throat was also cut. There were no evidence of robbery or SA. Strangely, 1 month after the murder, the local newspaper and the police department received a typewritten letter titled "The Confession" from someone who claimed to be the killer. The author wrote, "Miss Bates was stupid. She went to the slaughter like a lamb," and added, "I am not sick. I am insane." Then in April 1967, the newspaper, as well as the police and Joseph Bates, received virtually identical handwritten letters which read, "Bates had to die. There will be more." The notes were signed with a symbol that resembled the letter Z. And just 5 nights before Christmas 1968, high school students Betty Lou Jensen, who was 16, and David Faraday, 17, went on their very first date. They promised to be home by 11 p.m. They left the house to attend a festival at Hogan High School, which was only 3 blocks from Betty's home, and then they were going to go to a house party afterwards. To the surprise of their parents, there was no high school party, neither was there a house party. Apparently, David was just so madly in love that the couple planned on going to San Francisco that night. Unfortunately, before they could ever make it, they were senselessly murdered. A passerby noticed 2 seemingly lifeless bodies on the side of the Lake Herman Road. When police showed up, Betty Lou was dead with 5 bullet wounds in her back. David was found next to the Rambler with a bullet wound in his head, still breathing but near death. There were bullet holes in the car's roof and back window, indicating that the killer may have fired warning shots to force the victims out of the vehicle. It was 1969 when Darlene Farron, a popular waitress in Vallejo, California, became the next victim. The wife and mother picked up a friend, Michael Magoo, on July 4th, 1969. She stopped her Corvair in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park. It was around midnight when a vehicle pulled into the lot, then it left and returned minutes later, only for the driver to get out of the car, shine a light through Darlene's car, and fire with a 9mm handgun. Michael was shot in the jaw, shoulder, and leg. Darlene was hit several times. At approximately 12:40, a man rang the Vallejo Police Department and claimed responsibility for the shooting, as well as the murders on Lake Herman Road. The call was traced to a gas station payphone. According to the police dispatcher, the caller spoke in a low, monotonous voice, saying, "I want to report a murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed the kids last year. Goodbye." Darlene died on arrival at the hospital, but Michael survived. Investigators were unable to identify any viable suspects. That same year, September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing along the shore of Lake Berryessa. A man wearing a hooded costume, clip-on glasses, and white cross circle stitched over the chest, the now known trademark of the Zodiac, appeared holding a gun. Cecilia would alert Brian with the words, "Oh my God, he's got a gun." The Zodiac oddly explained to the couple that he had escaped from a prison and needed money and a car to escape to Mexico. He bound the couple's wrists with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline, and without warning, he plunged a large knife into Brian's back 6 times. He then stabbed Cecilia 10 times. The Zodiac then left them there, and he went to write on Brian's car with a pen. He drew a cross circle on the door with the dates and location of the attacks. The date, September 27, 69, the time, 6:30, and the weapon he used, by knife. Then around 7:40, a man called the Napa Police Department to report a double murder. The caller described Brian's car, directed police to the scene of the crime, and confessed, quote, "I'm the one who did it." Now, I find his behavior a bit strange. I suppose it's not like super strange, but I don't understand why he would fabricate a story about escaping prison and then needing money, but leaves behind the girl's wallet and takes only Brian's pocket change. And then he goes on to stab the couple instead of using the gun he had pointed at them earlier. I mean, he's obviously sick and twisted, so it does make sense, I suppose. But he never used a knife except for the Bates murder, which is only possibly linked to the Zodiac. Then he writes on the car instead of mailing in the letter like he does with the other cases. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I find his sporadic behavior strange. But anyways, there was some evidence found at the scene, like a boot print, and plaster casts were made. The print left was a size 10.5. Government issued wing walker. They were Air Force and Navy issued boots. Now the next case I wanted to dig a little deeper in because I just find it bizarre, and not so much the Zodiac himself, but the officers that were on the scene that night. There's just so much inconsistencies in the timelines that the officers reported that don't necessarily make sense to me, and I could be overthinking this, so I apologize in advance. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but let's just get into it. So Paul Stein, a 28-year-old student and husband, worked as a cab driver in San Francisco. At around 9:40 p.m. on October 11, 1969, a man hailed the yellow cab over. He requested to be driven to Washington and Maple Street in the Presidio Heights, but for whatever reason unknown, Paul Stein drove 1 block past Maple to Cherry Street. My theory is the Zodiac didn't want any witnesses to the crime that he was just about to commit, as I believe he was headed to the Presidio Wall playground, and if he had committed the crime there, then the witnesses on that street would see him walking north to the Julius Kahn playground. So once he gets to Cherry and Washington, the passenger shoots Paul once in the head behind the right ear with a 9mm handgun. He then went to the passenger side, stole Paul's key and wallet, and removed a piece of Paul's bloody shirt, and apparently wiped away his fingerprints. He left before the cops could get there. Well, not completely, because when the cops arrived, he was still walking north. However, police had mistakenly described the suspect as a black man, so any white men that they saw, they would just kind of dismiss it. At 9:56, one of the teens called the police while the crime was still ongoing, meaning the Zodiac was still at the scene. Police then radio an APB, alerting police patrols about the crime and mistakenly identifying the suspect as a black male. We don't know how this mistake was made, but it is believed the witness may have been describing the color of the suspect's jacket. Now let's compare two different interviews, one in 2007 and the other in 1989. There are many contradictions with what Officer Falk said in 1968 compared to what he said in 2007. Now, I don't want to say anyone here is lying, but the timelines just don't add up or make sense to me. And I could be wrong, so please do correct me. I would like to know what exactly happened that night, and I'm sure we'll never find out, but let's just go through the timeline together. So dispatch went through at 9:58 p.m. so the officers would hear it at the very same time. There were 3 teens who witnessed the crime unfold. One of the teens, 16-year-old Lindsay Robbins, went down to get a closer look. The suspect then left and started calmly walking north on Cherry Street. Lindsay went outside to watch where he was going. The time was approximately 9:58 when Officer Armand Pellicetti and his partner were on the scene. He was close by. He traveled west on Washington Street, parking on the intersection of Washington and Cherry Street. At which time, according to Lindsay Robbins, the killer was still on site, walking north up on Cherry. In the 2007 interview, Officer Pellicetti said that after arriving, he saw 3 teenagers in the street heading over to the taxi and herded them back to the clove of their home. He claimed that he then went to the cab and he saw that Stein was most definitely dead, and then he went to retake the description from the teens. His partner was securing the crime scene. And it was then that he was told the suspect was a white male and understood from Lindsay that the suspect was in sight. However, it was too late. He stated, quote, "It was then I was told it was a white male. I couldn't get to the radio fast enough at that point to let everybody else know. The kids had told me whoever had done the crime had left the cab, went out the door and seemed to be wiping the cab down and reaching into the cab and ambling or walking down Cherry Street in a northerly direction, kind of towards the Presidio. I walked that way myself. I did not run because there are innumerable alcoves and parked cars, so I went down following every technique I knew so I didn't get my head blown off." This is where there are some discrepancies in the timeline. Please correct me if I'm wrong again. Pellicetti says at 9:59 p.m. he walked north up Cherry Street, turned right and walked east on Jackson Street to the corner of Jackson and Maple Street. Reminder, he had just got there at 9:58 p.m. so it is not possible to have herded the children back, checked on Stein, take down the description of the suspect, and then, yeah. It takes 1 minute to get to the top of Cherry and another minute to get to the Jackson and Maple, but remember he's walking carefully so he, quote, doesn't get his head blown off. And although he claims he walked up Cherry and then went down Jackson in 1 minute, it's not possible. So let's give him 5 minutes before he starts walking. The time is now 10:04. Let's give him a 4-minute walk because he's going very slow and isn't running. Now he's at Jackson and Maple around 10:08. Now let's focus on where Don Falk and Eric Zelms are because they're only a few minutes away, driving north up Presidio Avenue, just north of Washington Street. They heard the broadcast at the same time as Pellicetti and his partner. So where are Falk and Zelms? They should be on Cherry by now. They claim they turned left on Jackson and sped toward the crime scene. And about 2 minutes later, at approximately 9:59, just 2 blocks from the crime scene, Falk and Zelms observe a white man walking east along the sidewalk on the north side of Jackson Street, just west of Maple Street. The time aligns well with the Zodiac's statement after this incident, in which he writes, quote, "P.S. 2 cops pulled a goof about 3 minutes after I left the cab. I was walking down the hill to the park when the cop car pulled up." So by now, Pellicetti missed the Zodiac by 9 minutes, but also Officer Falk and Zelms. As Officer Falk claims, the white man turned as if stepping into a stairway leading up the front yard of one of the homes on north side of the street. However, since the police radio dispatcher had mistakenly alerted officers to be on the lookout for a black suspect, Falk just briefly slowed the car, then drove past without stopping and only observed the man for a few seconds or so, he claims. So this tells me Falk saw the suspect, took a different direction. Why? Well, there would be no reason to. He isn't aware Officer Palisetti is at the crime scene, so that is where he should be driving to. He should have been there by 10, since he only, quote, observed the man for a few seconds. He then claims only moments after seeing the suspect on Jackson Street, 3712 Jackson Street to be precise, he and Zelm stopped and spoke to Officer Palisetti on Cherry Street near the corner of Jackson. But at 10 o'clock, Palisetti was still on Cherry and Washington speaking to the teenagers and wouldn't have made it up Cherry yet. So they would be there at approximately 10:06 if they saw Palisetti going up Cherry. So this means that Officer Falk and Zelms are sort of missing from the crime scene for 6 minutes. When they see Palisetti, he informed Falk and Zelms that the suspect was in fact a white male. After this, Falk and Zelms turned around and went back to the corner of Maple and Jackson Street, then entered the Presidio and searched the area around Julius Kahn Playground. Mind you, there is also nothing in the initial report indicating that Falk told Palisetti that he had seen a man on Jackson Street. Palisetti later stated that Falk, quote, did not mention to me that he has seen anybody at that point or had stopped anybody. This is a point of disagreement between Falk and Palisetti over what had happened that night. Let's assume Falk is talking to the Zodiac. By the time Palisetti walks up Cherry and Jackson, then Jackson and Maple, he would see Falk if they were still around, but they aren't there. The Zodiac wrote, P.S. 2 cops pulled a goof about 3 minutes after I left the cab. I was walking down the hill to the park when the cop car pulled up. One of them called me over and asked if I saw anyone acting suspicious or strange in the last 5 to 10 minutes. I said yes, there was this man who was running by waving a gun, and the cops peeled rubber. Went around the corner as I directed them. I disappeared into the park a block and a half away, never to be seen again. Now, in the 1989 interview, which one would think is closer to what really happened since our memories are still there, Falk says, we proceeded on Jackson Street towards Arguello, continuing our search. As we arrived on Arguello Street, the description of the suspect was changed to a white male adult. Believing the suspect was possibly the one involved in the shooting, we entered the Presidio of San Francisco and conducted a search on West Pacific Avenue, the opposite side of the wall and the last direction we observed the suspect going. We did not find the suspect. The description of the suspect changes to white male, so they enter the Presidio of San Francisco and conduct a search on West Pacific Avenue. But why? They were called to Washington and Cherry to a crime scene. They aren't aware Palisetti is on the scene, or else he would have told them there and then that it was a white male they were looking for. So the right course of action would be to turn southbound on Cherry to the crime scene. Again, they were not called onto West Pacific Avenue, so at some point he saw the suspect on Jackson and then ended up on Arguello. But then remember, he said he's seen the white male suspect, and the Zodiac wrote that he had indeed given them directions and they had peeled rubber and went around the corner as they were directed to by him. So if Falk saw the Zodiac at 3712 Jackson as he claimed, he would have performed a U-turn and gone straight back to 3712 Jackson. But since he claims he's going to West Pacific Avenue, it is more likely he saw the Zodiac heading towards West Pacific Avenue via Jackson and Maple. So I guess maybe my theory is the Zodiac pretends to go up some stairs. He directs Falk and Zelms down Maple and Washington, since this is where the Zodiac was initially supposed to be dropped off. It makes sense he would direct them this way, since he's the kind of sick individual who likes playing games. Then as Falk and Zelms get to the crime scene and up Cherry Street, they meet with Officer Palisetti, who may be going north at this point in time. He tells them it is a white male they're looking for. Instead of going back to the last spot they saw the Zodiac, possibly they would take a left turn on Jackson and are now on Arguello Boulevard, where the dispatch is heard again. This ties in well with what folks said in the 1989 interview. I also want to note that Falk never mentioned he ever saw someone that fit the description of the Zodiac. That is until a month after the murder, and only after the Zodiac sent in a letter claiming to speak to the officers, presumably Falk and Zelms. Falk adamantly and repeatedly stated that he and Zelms did not stop and speak with the suspect, but Eric Zelms' widow, Diana, says that Zelms told her that they did in fact stop the car and speak to the suspect. Quote, Diana said that Eric closely followed the Stein murder on television. He told her that when he and Falk saw WMA, white male adult, they quickly decided to question him. He said that they spoke to this man face to face. The man was polite, calm, and answered all of their questions. There was nothing suspicious about him. They then quickly left to continue their search for a BMA, black male adult, as had been broadcasted in the APB. Falk also got a good description of the Zodiac for someone who claims he only slowed down to look at. White male, 35 to 45 years old, 5'10", between 180 and 200 pounds, medium heavy build, barrel-chested, light-colored crew-cut hair, possibly graying in the back, medium complexion, wearing glasses, dark blue waist-length zipper-type jacket, navy or royal blue, zipped part way up, elastic cuffs and waistband, brown wool pants, pleated tight, baggy in the rear, may have been wearing low-cut shoes. Subject at no time appeared to be in a hurry, walking with a shuffling lope, slightly bent forward, head down. The subject's general appearance suggested Welsh ancestry. Let me know what your thoughts are on the timeline and the contradicting statements. I would love to hear, or do correct me if you believe I'm wrong. But moving on a Sunday in late March, 22-year-old Caitlin Johns packed her infant daughter into a station wagon and left San Bernardino, California. Caitlin was also 7 months pregnant with the child of her longtime boyfriend. As she traveled, a car parked alongside her and signaled for her to stop the car. On the side of the road, the man explained to Caitlin that her back wheel was wobbling. He loosened the lug nuts and the wheel fell off as Caitlin tried to drive off. The man offered to drive Caitlin to a gas station, so she got into his car, and that is when she realized he had other plans, and he started threatening her and her baby. Caitlin grabbed her daughter and jumped from the car. A passing driver took Caitlin to a nearby police station where she identified the stranger from a police sketch of the Zodiac. Months later, a Zodiac letter mentioned a, quote, rather interesting ride with a woman and her baby. Then on September 6, 1970, Donna Lass, a nurse at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, worked until 1:50 a.m., but later that day, both her employer and landlord received phone calls from an unknown male trying to claim that Donna left town due to a family emergency. Her car was later found abandoned near her apartment, and to this day, she has not been found. Netflix's new 3-part documentary, This is the Zodiac Speaking, is quite interesting because it is based on the Seawater family who knew Arthur Lee Allen as a family member. Now, Arthur Lee Allen was suspected to be the Zodiac, but to this day it is unknown who the Zodiac's true identity is. Allen was a Navy veteran who lived in Atascadero, California. He was also a school teacher at Santa Rosa Elementary in the early 1960s. Allen formed a close relationship with the Seawater's mother, Phyllis. He frequently joined the family for dinner and took the children out on trips. David, Connie, and Don Seawater joined Allen on a trip to the beach outside Santa Barbara, California. Allen told them to stay in the car, and when he returned, Connie said that he had come back out of breath and that his hands were covered in red stuff. The kids recalled that this was the same day as the suspect's first Zodiac killing, when Robert Domenico and his fiancée Linda Edwards were shot dead on the same beach. As I mentioned earlier, the murder wasn't officially accredited to the Zodiac. 3 years later, on October 28, 1966, Allen took David Seawater, who was a high school sophomore, and Connie, who was a freshman, to spend 2 nights in Riverside. Strangely, on October 30, David was allegedly in a deep sleep in the motel and couldn't be woken up. Connie recalled going on a drive with Allen, and when she returned to the motel, she drank some juice and fell into a deep sleep. All she remembers is Allen leading them to the car on October 31st. The siblings believe that it is no coincidence that on October 30, Sherry Jo Bates was found stabbed to death. In the documentary, Connie also alludes to Alan potentially confessing to the Zodiac crimes and reveals that she even asked him years later, and Alan said if he told her he'd have to, quote, kill her. David got a more definitive answer. Alan was gravely ill in 1992. His mother told him to reach out to David. When he did, Alan shockingly admitted to drugging his sister and essaying her years prior. David then asked Alan if he is the Zodiac Killer. David reveals that Alan confessed that he was the Zodiac Killer. I think the documentary on Netflix did a good job of showing the different sides to Alan. He had a soft side, but he was also strange and a sick individual, which really ties him well to the Zodiac. Was he the killer? I honestly don't know. He could be a serial killer. I'm not sure if he's the Zodiac though. DNA and fingerprints lifted from several items connected with the Zodiac crimes have failed to produce any match, including a palm print lifted from the Exorcist letter on January 29, 1974. Alan's sketch also bears little resemblance to the Zodiac sketch. He also underwent handwriting tests using specific pens, and the tests also involve particular words found in the Zodiac's letter. A handwriting expert determined there was no correlation between the Zodiac's letter and Alan's handwriting. The Zodiac committed his crimes between December 1968 and October 1969. His last letter was 1974. Alan was arrested for child essay in 1974. He spent 3 years in prison and then served 5 years of felony probation until 1982. Arthur Lee Allen was the only suspect named by police. He died on August 26, 1992, at the age of 58. Was Arthur Lee Allen the Zodiac Killer? I don't know. Was he a serial killer? I have no idea. But he is very suspicious, and I must say there are a lot of similarities between him and the Zodiac, so I'd believe it if you told me he was the Zodiac. Anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, and yeah, take care and stay safe, and see you next time.